Oh, today we are talking with Elliot Overton, and he's kind of like a rock star in the functional medicine world, especially around thiamine, high dose thiamine. He's a nutritional therapist and certified functional medicine practitioner. And Elliot has always been intrigued by alternative healing. And then after developing some health issues himself, he started to delve deeper into how to heal in a holistic way, in a naturopathic way, by using nutrition and basic lifestyle principles. And he now works with people one-on-one to use these naturopathic, nutritional, and functional medicine approaches that they can practically apply to their lives to heal. So, Elliot, welcome. So great to see you today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And you told me earlier that you are coming to us from the south of France, which I bet it's gorgeous there.
Yeah, it's probably about 30 degrees at the moment in Celsius. So yeah, it's a bit of a change from the UK.
Yeah, I'd expect so. A bit more sun there too.
Indeed.
So, I myself actually just ran across this concept of high dose thiamine maybe 4 months ago. Never heard of it before. But as I started reading more about it, I was like, oh, this makes sense to me. So, can you tell us a little bit about how you first ran across it and how you first started employing it, how you first started using it?
Yeah, of course. So a couple of years ago, doing some research as I like to do, I came across a book that had been published by two of the other guests that you've got on this summit, Dr. Derek Lonsdale and Chandler Mars. It was called Thiamine Deficiency, High Calorie Malnutrition, and sorry, I've forgotten the name.
Well, that's because it's like really
Thiamine
long.
Deficiency Disease, Dysautonomia, and
Just-
High Calorie Malnutrition. There you go. Yeah, so I came across that book and it intrigued me for some reason. I wasn't too familiar with the concept of thiamine deficiency. I was taught in nutrition school that it had mostly been eradicated. In most of the training I've done, there's not really been any focus on using vitamin B1 thiamine for many, if any, health conditions. It's primarily looking at the other B vitamins, B12,
Right.
folate, B6, niacin, etc. So this was kind of a novel concept. I was not familiar with it, so I went ahead and bought the book. And within a very short period of time, I kind of realized that there was a lot that I didn't know and a lot that I needed to learn.
Yeah.
In short, they detail probably how, or they detail the likelihood that there's a very common deficiency within the Western world, or any country that consumes the kind of standard Western diet, standard American diet. Thiamine, out of all of the B vitamins, is probably the B vitamin that goes most overlooked. It's the kind of most underrated deficiency, I think. And it seems to have some really good capacity to like radically improve some people's health. And throughout that book, there was lots of case studies and diagrams, and it's very technical. And I really like the technical details. But in the case studies, some really remarkable, miraculous recoveries from conditions which are generally pretty difficult to address via nutrition. I'll give you an example: postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, otherwise known as POTS. This is a pretty ambiguous condition when you're looking at kind of nutritional therapies, what can work, what can't work. And thiamine, or vitamin B1, it seems to be as though it's like the main thing which can help that condition. It can really benefit the nervous system in a variety of ways. But long story short, basically, I came across this book, and then I very quickly devoured all the information that I could find. I've read probably a lot of the I don't want to say most of the published literature on thiamine, because that would frankly be impossible. There's thousands of papers, but I've read a lot. I've spent several years it's been my primary focus. And so after kind of learning as much as I could about this, looking at the case studies, Derek Lonsdale's experience, I started applying it clinically in some of the really difficult clients, the people with very complex health conditions, ME, CFS, multiple chemical sensitivity, post-viral fatigue, fibromyalgia, that were kind of non-responsive to the ordinary types of therapies that you might come across, the mitochondrial cocktails and the other supplements and the other diets. What I witnessed was nothing short of amazing, honestly. In several cases now, I have had people come to me who've been to top doctors, top functional medicine doctors, top nutritionists. They've been to everyone. They've been to all of them, and nothing that they've tried has worked. They have gone for infections. They've gone for heavy metals. They've tried every diet under the sun, and they continue maybe not to get worse, but they very much stagnate. And so in some of these people, again, it seems as though thiamine was overlooked. Thiamine was the missing link. And thiamine was one of the things that provided them with benefits that they could not get anywhere else. And since there's not really many others in the alternative health or conventional field which talk about the benefits of this, I figured that that would be one of my aims moving forward, is to try to learn as much about this, to spread the word as much as possible, and try to educate others, particularly practitioners, and try to kind of shout from the rooftops how useful vitamin B1 can be when applied to different health conditions. So yeah, that's originally how I came across this.
So you have just done a beautiful job of leading us into about 3 different topics here that that I'm interested in. So first of all, the fact that you mentioned POTS, because POTS is a condition that lots of our long COVIDers have developed as well, and that goes along a lot of times with ME/CFS. So I know that our POTS people as well are going to be happy to hear that that is sometimes positively affected by the thiamine therapy. So you also mentioned, though, that not many people have been exploring this, not many doctors, not many nutritionists. So what that ends up doing is leaving the patient, leaving the person with the illness in a place where we have to kind of experiment with things, which is really the main thing that I wanted to talk to you about, because for some people it seems to be a fairly straightforward supplementation, right? You take this much thiamine along with a B complex and magnesium, and you should be fine. But I also know, and this is where your specific expertise comes in, that for some people, it's definitely not that simple. So, for instance, I took high-level thiamine for about 2 months, and it ended up really messing up some other things. And I know that that's one of your specialties, is kind of looking at how these higher doses of thiamine can affect the other nutrients that are necessary for us. So can you talk about that a little bit? Why don't we start with why it is so easy for some people to just do the thiamine, and why for other people it becomes more complicated?
Okay.
Or wherever you'd like to start, I think.
Yeah, I mean, how to answer that question in
Yeah.
a straightforward way. There's lots of ways that we could go with that.
Yeah.
So the listeners, I assume, will be aware of the basics when it comes to what thiamine is, what B1 is. They'll have listened to the discussions with Derek Lonzel, Chandler Mars. So
Yeah.
assuming that people have a rough understanding or basic understanding of this nutrient, if we look at what it is functioning to do, it's central to carbohydrate metabolism. So how we're breaking down sugars, carbohydrates from the diet, converting those into energy. It's also central in how we are breaking down fats, converting those into energy. But what we have to understand is that you use numerous other nutrients to do that, okay? And it's not just B1 that's important. In fact, B1 is a small piece of the puzzle, and in some people it's a game changer. In other people, it's not. Have you spoken about Costantini's research on fibromyalgia
We have,
with?
yeah, we have not. And that's one of the things that I wanted for us to talk
Okay,
about. Yeah. Yeah.
okay. So just so the listeners kind of are aware, when we're looking at thiamine, taking thiamine, supplementing thiamine, the recommended daily allowance is about 1 to 1.5 milligrams per day, what you get from food. Okay. That's like the minimum. That's the minimum to prevent a deficiency under normal circumstances. That's based on research, which was done a very long time ago. But essentially, they said, okay, if you have less than 1 to 1.5 milligrams per day, you can develop a full blown deficiency disease, whether it be Wernicke's encephalopathy, beriberi, wet beriberi, etc. Okay. So if you look at most supplements, you'll find that they are, say, a multivitamin or even a standalone thiamine. They will generally contain anywhere between 50 milligrams and 100 milligrams. That's approximately 30 to 50 times the amount that you would be getting from the diet. Okay. If you look at the research on using high dose thiamine, well, if we think of what high dose means, you'd think that 100 or 50 times the amount that's recommended daily, like times the RDA, 50 milligrams, 100 milligrams, that would be megadose. That would be incorrect. So the amount that you need to technically megadose, you're sitting at around maybe 300 to 4,000 times the amount that you would get from food in any one given day. Okay. Now, if we look at some of the evidence, it's quite remarkable. So there was a neurologist. He's passed away now, unfortunately. He was an Italian. His name was Antonio Costantini. And he theorized, based on a wide variety of different research publications over time, he came up with the theory that basically what might be happening in certain neurological conditions, he was a neurologist by trade, in certain neurological conditions, the evidence was pointing to this idea that the processes which occur in the brain, that means how the brain makes energy, how the brain maintains its structure, its function, the release of neurotransmitters, the health of the myelin sheath, for instance, the balance of neurotransmitters, neurochemicals. He theorized that the processes which were happening in the brain, which need B1, which need thiamine, that they were being turned off for some reason. Okay. And when those processes are turned off, it's basically, it has to do with like these enzymes. Enzymes convert one thing into another thing. And what you can end up with is this inhibition of certain enzymes. So you think if your enzymes are inhibited in the brain, then that slows down these processes. Now, what he found was that by giving very, very, very high doses, we're talking at least 1,000 milligrams per day, sometimes even more. So that's 1,000 times what you would get from food. It's a massive amount. He found that only by giving ultra high doses to certain people could he produce a resolution in symptoms. So, for instance, he's got there's a website dedicated specifically to this topic. It's called htt.org, highdosethymine.org. And basically his work, he's well known for his work in Parkinson's. So in certain people with Parkinson's, he could produce almost symptomatic remission. That means they would go from having full-blown Parkinson's disease to having basically no signs and symptoms of Parkinson's disease with very, very, very consistently high doses of thiamine. He would find that as soon as they stopped taking thiamine, their symptoms would resume. He had similar research on multiple sclerosis, essential tremor, chronic fatigue syndrome, and fibromyalgia. Now, there's a landmark study. I say it's a study, it's a case report. I think you would probably find very similar effects if you did do a larger study. The problem is, I don't think he could get funding for this. It's quite difficult to do because it's not a very profitable kind of area of work.
Right.
But basically, there was a case study of 3 individuals. And whilst it's a small sample size, I've seen this play out a number of times in real life. So I'm convinced that it's genuine. Basically, in fibromyalgia, they showed that they would dose thiamine hydrochloride, a standard, very cheap form of thiamine. They would dose it they would start at 1,000 milligrams, and they would gradually build up as the days go on, up until they reached kind of 2,000 milligrams, 2,500 milligrams. Now, what he showed was that when they reached a certain point, when they reached the kind of threshold of 1,500 milligrams or 1,800 milligrams per day, they collectively, they saw approximately a 60 to 80% improvement in all of their symptoms. Wow. Now, for someone with chronic severe fibromyalgia, that's very significant,
that's
right?
Huge. Yeah.
It was basically the difference between being able to walk around and not being in chronic pain and being in bed, kind of thing. So yeah, that's what he found. And since then, people who've come across his research, they have done the same thing. They've attempted it themselves, and many have found symptomatic resolution. So almost remission from their condition using these kind of megadoses. It's important to note that Costantini found that at lower doses, you did not see the same effect. Okay. So the amount that you would find in supplements produced zero changes. So, and for these people, it was like a threshold had been met. It was like 1,400 milligrams, there was no change whatsoever. And he described this as an all or nothing effect. So 1,400 milligrams, basically no change. As soon as they hit 1,500, and especially at 1,800, for some reason, that was like a special number. And that immediately, almost there was a night or day difference. Many of the symptoms basically just melted away, disappeared. And so you would think ordinarily, through like based on just ordinary nutritional science, if you were simply addressing a deficiency, then using 1,400 times the amount that you of the RDA, you'd think that that would produce some improvements, but it didn't. And so he theorized that what is happening when you're using ultra mega doses, you're not using it to address the deficiency. You're not trying to address a thiamine deficiency, which is quite common, but in some cases it's not the case. What you're trying to do is you're trying to stimulate those processes which have been turned down, which have been shut off for some reason. We don't know why that is.
Right.
So in his research, they used very high doses of thiamine by itself. They didn't use any of the cofactors. But in working with people and on the groups, right, you would see that many people would not respond very positively if they're just given thiamine. And there's various reasons for that. It's like the B vitamins, they come as a complex for a reason. And you don't really ever find one B vitamin in a food. You would find a complex of Bs at different ratios. And the reason for that is because the processes that we need B vitamins for, you usually need more than one to do any given thing at any given time. You know, for instance, if you want to take sugar, carbohydrate, and break it down into its kind of next step, you need B1, but you also need niacin. You also need many of the other B vitamins to basically convert food into energy. It's not just one B vitamin. So the overall advice, and this is something that Lonsdale has said from the beginning, is that when anyone is taking vitamin B1 in any significant dose whatsoever, they should be taking a vitamin B complex behind that at any one given time, okay? Just so that you're trying to hit all of the different bases. At the same time, there's minerals, which are really important. One of those in particular is magnesium. So thiamine and magnesium, they share, they're like, what's the word? Companions in many cases. The processes that you use thiamine for in the nervous system, in the cells to make energy, to build things up, you also need magnesium. And there's research showing that if you just give thiamine by itself, even to someone who has full-blown thiamine deficiency disease and they're kind of on their deathbed, if you give thiamine by itself, sometimes it's not effective unless magnesium is given at the same time. And that's because when you're taking high doses of thiamine, you're speeding certain processes up, but you need to make sure that you have all of the other tools to be able to speed those processes up kind of at the same time behind that, right? So the basic protocol that we would use for mega dosing B1 is picking a form of thiamine, finding a form of thiamine, gradually building up. So starting at a low dose, working up very gradually, depending on tolerance. And the important to do is at least giving a basic multi B complex behind that. Right now, that's oftentimes it's not sufficient to do so just by itself. You would give a basic B complex behind that, magnesium, and some other minerals depending on each individual situation. Okay, and there's lots of individual situations that might occur.
Yeah.
And like in your case, I mean, if you're taking thiamine, you're having a strong reaction to that, there's usually going to be a reason. Now, again, I'm not sure if Lonsdale has discussed this, but there is what he termed and what the Japanese knew very clearly is this concept of a paradoxical reaction, this concept of someone getting worse before they get better. And this is particularly pronounced in people with long COVID, people with chronic fatigue syndrome, people with ME, CFS interchangeable, people with fibromyalgia. Generally, there is a worsening of symptoms. And there's a couple of theories for why that is. I have my own ideas why that might be. Lonsdale has his. Overall, it would seem as though it is almost a guarantee that someone is going to get worse before they get better. And that's usually the main presenting symptoms that are caused by like a deficit of thiamine. They are going to get worse for the most part, or some of those will. Some symptoms might improve. I'll give you an example. If someone has severe chronic digestive issues, maybe they have low stomach acid, so hypochlorhydria, they have constipation, they have nutrient malabsorption, they have chronic bloating, and they also have severe body pain, so fibromyalgia, and severe fatigue. They might take thiamine, they might take a very high dose, and what they might find is that their constipation disappears very quickly, that their hypochlorhydria, so that their stomach acid starts kind of renormalizing very quickly, but their fatigue and their fibromyalgia pain get a lot worse. Okay? That's very common. It could go the opposite way as well. It could be that their fatigue, brain fog, and energy improve, but actually their digestive system slows right down. And so ordinarily someone might try this, and if they're not aware that you can get this natural worsening, they might try this, and then all of a sudden they stop. They get a bit scared. They're like, oh no, okay, this is not good for me because it's actually worsening some of my symptoms. But again, this is where kind of self-education comes in, knowing what to expect, knowing the kind of symptoms that this can cause, and potentially ways to mitigate that as well. Because there are certain ways that someone can potentially mitigate the side effects.
So I have a quick question within this too. So if someone is experiencing worsening of symptoms, and maybe even other symptoms that they may not have noticed before, would the recommendation be to keep going, or to cut back on the thiamine, or to, it's kind of like flying blind, because like we said earlier, there aren't many people out there who know how to do this, and it is so individualized. So what do you recommend to people as far as, okay, what's the next step? You've been doing this for a couple of months now, and either things are getting worse, or yeah.
Okay, so I would want to know, hypothetically, of course, what was made worse, how long someone had done it for, and what else they were taking. It's really quite individual. Okay, I'll give you an example. If someone, there are different forms, right? And I'm not sure if you've spoken to Chandler or Lonsdale about this, but the different forms represent different ways to get thiamine into the body. And some are, let's say, technically superior, but they're not as well tolerated. Right, so if we're looking at the types that you can get on the market, well, the cheapest is thiamine mononitrate. That's what's going to be in generally quite cheap supplements.
So thiamine HCl.
No, sorry. So this is thiamine mononitrate.
Okay.
Yeah, thiamine mononitrate. It's a type of thiamine salt. That you have the thiamine salts, you have thiamine mononitrate, which is very cheap, and you have thiamine hydrochloride, HCl. Okay. These are generally 99% of the time, this is what you're going to find on the market for thiamine. Okay. Now, these have the benefits. These are what have been used in the research by Costantini in chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia to show improvements. Okay. So these do have their benefits, but to get clinical benefit, you generally need to go, hundreds, if not thousands of times the recommended daily allowance just to get any benefit, because due to their chemical structure, they are not very well absorbed. Okay, they're just not very well absorbed in the gut. So, you have these natural mechanisms to prevent you from absorbing, or to, let's say, the amount that you can absorb at any one given time is limited. It's just limited because you've only got so many kind of passages through which thiamine can get into the body. And that when they're all clogged up because you've given yourself so much thiamine, well, you can't get any more in. So this is one of the reasons for using such high doses of these kind of inferior forms. You have three other forms which are, in their own right, they are superior in terms of their delivery getting into the body. Probably the most well-known and the most spoken about in alternative health, at least, is benfotiamine. Benfotiamine is a derivative. Just so that you know, what I mean by derivative is something which contains a thiamine molecule, but which has other chemical properties which give it certain attributes. Okay, so most of these were developed in Japan. I think all of them were developed in Japan because historically that was where they studied thiamine the most, because they were dealing with the problem of beriberi for a very long time. Mm-hmm. So they did a lot of research. They looked at the derivatives. They looked at benfotiamine. They synthesized it. And basically it is referred to as a fat soluble, a lipid soluble form. It's not technically fat soluble, but it does have certain attributes which allow it to bypass these kind of limited transport systems that the other forms can't bypass. So I'll give you an example. If you take a thiamine salt, you can only absorb approximately 5 to 10% of it at any one given time, and the rest is going to be pooped out. Okay. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, with benfotiamine, the amount that you're absorbing is anywhere from kind of maybe 50% to 90% in some of the research. You can get a much higher dose of B1 through the gut into the bloodstream. Okay. And so that is a really good way to increase the levels of B1 and can be used in mega doses. On the other hand, it also doesn't quite have as many good qualities as some of the other forms. If we look at Japan's most prized form, their favorite form, that is called TTFD. So TTFD is a very special molecule. It's structurally similar to a type of thiamine that you'd find in garlic. It's called allithiamine. But what this particular form does, not only does it bypass all of the kind of transport barriers in the gut kind of thing, so you can provide almost 90 to 99% in some studies of the thiamine molecule. You administer 100 milligrams and you might absorb kind of 95 milligrams into the blood. The benefit with TTFD, and I think this is one of the reasons why the Japanese favored this particular form, was because TTFD, not only can it get into the blood very quickly, but it gets into the brain very easily. And Chandler or Derek have probably spoken about this, but the brain is ultimately the main place that thiamine deficiency is going to hit first, because the brain needs so much energy, especially the parts of the brain which control the autonomic nervous system. And on the topic of COVID, if we're looking at long COVID, well, many of the symptoms of long COVID, they're practically identical to long-standing beriberi, or many of them are very similar to underlying thiamine deficiency, as in POTS, for instance, or dysautonomia, breathlessness, typical peripheral neuropathy, central neurological symptoms, which are classified under the umbrella of dysautonomia. These are classic post-COVID or long COVID symptoms, right? Yeah. Many people experience. Yep. And I believe, and I know that Chandler and Lonsdale also are of a similar mind, that in many of these cases, this kind of dysfunction of the autonomic nervous system, this can relate, or this can be primarily caused by a lack of energy, a lack of usable energy in the regions of the brain which are responsible for controlling this entire system, right? And so if we're looking at, if someone has an energy deficit in the lower parts of the brain, if they have problems regulating their central peripheral nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, and then you're really going to want to try to get something into the brain which can address the problems with energy. And if the problems with energy relate to thiamine, then you're going to want to use a form of thiamine which can get into the brain very quickly, get into the cells, and really kind of boost the way that cells are making energy. And so in that kind of situation, TTFD is kind of my preferred form, and I found it to be kind of the most clinically beneficial.
Right.
But back to your original question, if you're looking at, okay, if someone has tried B1, if they have tried many different forms, because this is something that I haven't spoken about, but the form that someone is going to respond well to is really different between each different person. I can say that TTFD is superior in its ability to get into the brain cells, get into the kind of increased thiamine levels in the central nervous system. But ultimately, some people cannot tolerate this very well, and we'll probably go into why that is slightly later on. So in that case, someone may benefit from one of the other forms. So let's assume that someone has tried a variety of different forms. They have kind of come to the conclusion there's one form they tolerate the best, but even then they have tried very low doses. They've tried kind of, 5 milligrams, then 10 milligrams, then 20 milligrams, and then gradually worked it up. And they're trying all of the other cofactors, and yet they still feel as though it's making them worse. Then I would be starting to consider some other possibilities. For instance, is thiamine is it going to be kind of the primary therapeutic agent in this person's situation? Because I've spoken many times about thiamine. You read any of Chandler Mars's or Lonsdale's writing, it's very easy for you to read it. And if your symptoms relate, then you think that this is going to be the thing that fixes your health. And I can understand that. And I see it very often. Sometimes it's just not the case. Sometimes it's that there are other nutrients which need to be addressed beforehand. The only way to know that is through testing, right? So for those people, I would say, find a provider who could provide you access to like maybe an organic acids test or a nutritional evaluation by Genova Diagnostics, or some other kind of comprehensive functional test for B vitamin status, for mineral status, because it could be the case that someone is running a severe deficit in riboflavin, and the amount that they're getting in their B complex is not sufficient to meet their demand. It could be that they are very low in niacin, and this is a really common nutritional deficiency, but let's say they're low in niacin, then it doesn't matter how much B1 you throw into the mix. And in fact, I have good reason to believe that giving someone B1 when they are niacin deficient is probably going to make them a lot worse. Okay.
That's what I was wondering about, because once you start messing with those B vitamins, when you're taking them up to such high doses, if anybody's deficient in any of the other B vitamins, especially that are involved in these particular things that we're talking about as far as, creating energy, then, does it mean that those other Bs can get down to doses to amounts in the body that are going to cause problems ultimately?
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. For some people, it does seem as though there are depleting effects, right? It's like when you give a high dose of something, you are theoretically at least increasing the requirement for other things. Okay. So one example, when you're giving thiamine, you are raising the requirement for riboflavin, B2. And many people are low in B2 anyway. In fact, it's probably the most common deficiency I see, like from testing, aside from B1, is B2. So in many people, they're already running like suboptimal B2 status. When they take thiamine can, in some cases, cause B2 wasting. That's been established. It also increases the requirement for B2. It can theoretically increase the requirement for, you think about it, right? It's like cogs in a machine, right? You have multiple different cogs and they're all connected to one another. And if you say you get like a spanner or something, or you start turning one of the cogs, the machine's not going to start working unless all of the cogs are running. So let's say, for a well-functioning machine, it needs to be oiled and all of the cogs work in tandem. Whereas if you have a couple of rusty cogs, by giving thiamine, you're addressing one of those. But if you've still got a bunch of other rusty cogs, then the machine is not going to work as it's meant to work. So the idea is that, okay, it doesn't necessarily mean that you don't need thiamine or that you won't benefit from it, but it means that you have to do some groundwork beforehand. And that's where further investigation is going to come in, right? So again, there's several reasons for why someone might not be able to tolerate B1. I mean, there's also the possibility, right? There is also the possibility that what is occurring is that if someone has been low for a long time, if they have passed the kind of situation where they feel as though they might be going through a paradox. I mean, a paradox generally would last anywhere from like a week to a couple of weeks kind of thing. If they've gotten worse and it's been 3 weeks and they still feel as though they're getting worse or they're not improving whatsoever, it could be that they have, I mean, looking at like a differential diagnosis, it could be that someone is dealing with some kind of an infection, for instance, right? Mm-hmm. And that what B1 is doing, I mean, this does occur, this has occurred, and I've seen it occur in several cases, is that if you factor in your immune system, like every other system in your body requires energy to function, right? So your immune cells to deal with pathogens, virus, bacteria, protozoa, spirochetes, you name it, you need energy. And so if someone has been low in B1 and their immune system has been dysfunctional, at least part because of that, then by giving B1, what you can do is you can you can wake up the immune system. And I've seen on several occasions people with ME/CFS who have gone years without having a fever, for instance, right? Yeah. They can't get a fever no matter what. They don't get sick. You give them B1 and all of a sudden they start actually building up a fever. It's like their immune system is starting to kick back in. They might get the flu for the first time in 4 years ever since they got sick, right? So what B1 is doing is, in many cases at least, speeding up or kind of increasing the efficiency at which you make energy. But what you direct that energy for, if you've got chronic infections and things and your immune system starts kicking in and you're dealing with infections, you're using that extra energy for your immune system, someone's going to likely feel terrible, So, just because someone feels as though they're getting worse doesn't necessarily mean that B1 is not doing its job, but it just means that they have a lot of other stuff that they likely need to deal with. And then there's always the last possibility that they just don't need B1, right? And that actually by taking B1, they're influencing the other things, they're depleting the other things, or they're just getting some kind of unwanted side effects. I mean, that can happen in small cases, in a small proportion of people who do take B1, so there's a couple of kind of possibilities here.
Right. And it's so interesting because it's very difficult to work out what of those, what 4 different possibilities is happening. So first of all, so when we talk about beriberi, I think that that's so interesting because the translation is roughly, I can't. And for those of you that we're talking to here, you probably have been feeling that for a while now. So the similarities there, like you said, are just incredible. And then, it is difficult to say, okay, well, do I take a look at some of the other cofactors that could be missing here? I know that in just doing research in Facebook groups and things like that, some people do have to supplement with glutathione. Some people have to take certain Bs way up. So it becomes a very frustrating thing. But then at the same time, there are the people who try the high dose thiamine with only maybe magnesium, say, or B complex, and it is almost an overnight change. So,
yeah, indeed. And when you find someone like that, they are over the moon within a very short period of time, kind of thing. There are people who have been bedbound, like as in bedbound for a very long time, take B1, and it's a rough couple of weeks, but then within a month, 2 months, 3 months, they are, say 80% functional again, right? And it is like a night and day difference. So I believe that this kind of therapy has a great deal of promise for people who do have this kind of spectrum of conditions, which are classed as CFS, fibromyalgia, ME, even long COVID, right? And I just want to make my position clear on long COVID is that I don't think that this is all that different to any other kind of post-viral chronic fatigue, right? Because, I mean, there is an established diagnosis, post-viral fatigue syndrome, right? And if you look at the symptoms of post-viral fatigue syndrome, it's essentially the same as chronic fatigue syndrome. The only difference is that in their history, it was a viral infection which triggered the the chronic fatigue, right? And although this is getting a lot of press, long COVID, ultimately there's always going to be quite a significant percentage of people who get viral infections who develop these kinds of symptoms after viral infection. And it comes back to this kind of concept that Derek Lonsdale laid out very well in his book, Thiamine Deficiency Disease, Dysautonomia, and High Calorie Malnutrition. Essentially, that there is usually a straw that broke the camel's back, right? So when someone's deficiency manifests, or when these wide variety of symptoms manifest, ultimately, it's rarely the thing that triggered it is the cause. It's that there is a cumulative, a long list of things which has been going on for many years, which may not have been producing symptoms, and then all of a sudden there can be an infection. It might be an infection, but again, the infection oftentimes, I believe, or what I see is the infection is just the trigger. It's rarely the cause, it's just the trigger. And then in fact, it can be the loss of a loved one, it can be a trauma, It can be exposure to UV light, it can be some kind of toxicity, it can be anything which kind of tips someone, they're just kind of coasting on the edge, for a very long time, and they might feel okay. They're coasting on the edge. Something happens and boom, it's like a metabolic crisis, metabolic collapse, and they lose many of their functions. And again, when you're looking at people who are likely going to respond to B1, they're going to have symptoms in 3 of the main systems. And this is going to be either the gut, so it will be like, it can be a chronic diarrhea, or it can be basically a shutdown of the digestive system in any capacity. This can manifest as chronic severe constipation, gastroesophageal reflux. It can be kind of lack of digestive fluid. So people can no longer make stomach acid, digestive enzymes, bile. They can no longer propel the food through their intestine. So basically many of the commands from the nervous system to the intestine, or to the gut as a whole, slow down. So the gut is not told what it's meant to do from the brain, and you end up losing functioning. And it's one of the things that underlies like the gastroparesis. This is one of the main systems that's affected. The second is going to be the cardiovascular, so the heart and the circulatory system. And again, this applies to long COVID. I mean, many of the symptoms, the shortness of breath, for instance, the poor circulation, there's a variety of things that are associated with long COVID that are also found in thiamine deficiency, wet beriberi. The symptoms overlap quite significantly. And again, the third and probably the primary system that's going to be affected is the brain and the central nervous system, and that kind of also relates to the peripheral nervous system as well. So the kind of tingling, the anosmia, so that the lack of smell, lack of taste, vertigo, POTS, all of these different things are related to essentially either inflammation, so neuroinflammation, or a kind of dysfunctional energy metabolism in brain regions which are responsible for coordinating those various functions. And so when we factor that in, and when we factor in that thiamine and the other B vitamins are really essential for basically every single cell in the body, really a kind of deficiency in any of the B vitamins, but particularly B1 and B3, it can manifest as basically any number of symptoms. But when you look at the overlap between classical forms of beriberi and long COVID, you see that there are kind of like major overlaps there. So I think that that's kind of really important to discuss. And my clients with long COVID, I don't necessarily give them all that much of a different protocol as I would for people with other forms of post-viral fatigue, because I find that generally the people respond in a similar way to the same kind of things.
Yeah. And I've said from the very beginning that long COVID is post-viral fatigue syndrome. It's it's the same thing. But I want to go back to the niacin a little bit, because I remember actually, so I had severe ME/CFS 20 years ago for 8 years, and bedbound and housebound for most of that time. And that story, you've run across it before. But one of the things that I ran across as a possible treatment was high dose niacin. So actual with the flushing, not the flush free. And I did try that for a little while. So it's interesting to me that you brought up niacin as well. Could you talk to us a little bit more about how that fits into the picture specifically with this?
Yeah. Okay. So in people with long COVID, the two things that I have found, or I'll say the two foundational approaches that I found is high dose thiamine in the right form that suits the person. We've spoken about that, this idea of speeding up energy metabolism, etc., etc. Okay. On the other hand, it's niacin in a very particular form. Okay. So niacin, for listeners who aren't familiar, who haven't come across this, for people who don't know what it is, it's vitamin B3. Like a deficiency in B1 will cause beriberi, a deficiency in niacin will cause pellagra. Now, this is considered to be one of the things which is overcome by food fortification. And with modern diets, if someone's eating a balanced diet, then they will have enough niacin. And I tend to see that this is more true than it is for thiamine. So I see that less people are frankly deficient in niacin than they are in thiamine. But specifically in relation to COVID or long COVID and active COVID, I'm not entirely sure about post-viral, other forms of post-viral fatigue. There does seem to be a lot of research, a lot of mechanistic justification for the idea that COVID, or the severity of COVID infection and the length of kind of long COVID, so whether someone develops symptoms and those symptoms kind of stay full on periods of time, so what we know as long COVID, implicating niacin. Okay. And the reason is, okay, without going into too many details, if we're looking at what niacin does in the body, well, niacin is broken down into its active form. This is called NAD. Okay. Now, NAD is what's called a redox molecule, or it exists in a redox pair. Essentially, that means that it is used in so many biochemical reactions, and its function is either to donate an electron or to accept an electron. Okay. And when it donates an electron, that might be used for doing certain things. I'll give you an example: for building things up. On the other hand, when it gains an electron, it might be responsible for being involved in a process by which we're deriving food or deriving energy from food. Okay. So we've spoken about how thiamine is really important to break down sugar for energy. Well, niacin is also absolutely essential for breaking down sugar for energy. It's essential for breaking down fat for energy. It's essential for breaking down protein for energy. In fact, for every reaction that you use thiamine in with regards to how your cells are making energy, you're also using niacin. Okay. So niacin is used, if we're looking at energy metabolism, niacin is probably the most important. Okay. Because it's used in that many different reactions. Now, what they have shown in COVID infection, when someone gets COVID, one of the ways in which our cells are going to protect against COVID infection, we are going to be basically upregulating certain genes. Okay. We're going to be upregulating certain things. We're going to be using certain pieces of machinery inside the cell to calm down the inflammatory response, to deal with the viral infection, to silence the viral infection. Okay. There's various kind of immunological processes that occur when someone is infected with a virus. Now, some of those processes are dependent on niacin in the form of NAD. Okay. Now, what they've shown is that people with severe COVID, the severity of COVID, if I remember correctly, the severity of COVID is proportional to the amount of niacin that's depleted. I'll say that in a different way. Basically, someone who has severe COVID infection, this depletes them of a specific form of niacin, an active form of niacin called NAD. They become depleted, okay? And if they cannot replenish that, this has been associated with severity of COVID, so whether someone is likely going to die or not, the severity of the symptoms, whether they have a mild infection or whether it's very severe and they're hospitalized, and also whether they develop long COVID. So there's theories to explain long COVID in primarily in relation to this depletion of niacin inside the cell. And so what is happening is that many of the symptoms that are caused by COVID or associated with COVID, many of the symptoms associated with long COVID. So the lack of taste, the lack of smell, the severe fatigue, again, the neurological type symptoms, in some cases, body pains, all of the strange symptoms that are associated with long COVID, basically, right? There is some justification to explain them by a niacin depletion. And when that happens, right, if someone's depleted in niacin, they're not going to respond to thiamine. Okay. They're not going to respond to thiamine because thiamine, it's like that cog. We come back to that machine analogy. By giving thiamine, you're unrusting, you're derusting one of the cogs, but niacin is needed for every single cog, right? So if someone is depleted in niacin because they've had COVID and they've not managed to replenish their stores, then giving thiamine is likely to be unsuccessful. Okay. So within the alternative community, within my client base, and on many of the forums, many of the people, the citizen scientists who are trying to treat themselves for long COVID, they have found that niacin in the form of nicotinamide riboside is one of the most effective things at addressing many of the symptoms. Now, what I like to do is look at the overall clinical picture of long COVID and say, right, so we've got a variety of these symptoms which look like beriberi. We've got the cardiovascular, neurological, and digestive issues. And at the same time, we've got many other symptoms which look like pellagra. And there's actually researchers who've said, if you compare pellagra, B3 deficiency with long COVID or the severe COVID infection, they're remarkably similar. I say, right, okay, we've got two B vitamins which are massively implicated in this situation. We need to use both. Right. And so if we're looking at someone, again, we're coming back to thiamine and we're looking at why someone might not respond well to thiamine. Well, without going into the biochemistry, what you need to know is that the processes which need thiamine, you speeding those up, you can get a block. Basically, the way that you think of energy metabolism, I don't have like a diagram here with me, but it's like a cycle. Okay. It's a cycle. And there's lots of different steps. Okay. And what you do when you give one of the B vitamins, you're speeding up one process. Okay. One process. But for the entirety of the process, or all of the processes to increase kind of at the same time, that's what you need to make energy, to make ATP. And so by giving B1, you're speeding up one thing, or you're speeding up a couple of things. But if you've got if every other step is backlogged because someone is depleted in NAD, then taking thiamine could theoretically make someone a lot worse. And the reason is for that is because as you're trying to push, I think there's it's like you're pushing up against like a dam of water kind of thing, right? It's like you're pushing against it because you don't have the material for all of the entirety of the system to cycle kind of at the same pace. Then you can end up with theoretically, you can end up with higher levels of reactive oxygen species. You end up with what's called reductive stress. And I don't want to go into the details because it would probably give this, it's too detailed to kind of explain in this podcast without going on for half an hour. But basically, when there's a backlog, then that's a problem. And by giving one isolated B vitamin at any one given time, if there's a backlog due to multiple different B vitamins, the isolated B vitamin is likely not going to come in handy. And so in this kind of situation, what I found is that for some people who've not responded all that well to high dose thiamine, we shift the gears and we focus primarily on nicotinamide riboside. Okay. Nicotinamide riboside, it's the form of niacin which has been used to, or which has been shown to increase the pool of NAD positive, which is the NAD positive is the form which is depleted in long COVID. It's been shown to increase the pool of NAD positive more significantly than the other forms of niacin. And for doing that, we're looking at, anywhere from 900 to 2000 milligrams per day. So there does seem to be a relationship between these two things. When someone is, you see, the body can make niacin by itself. It can make niacin. It does it from an amino acid called tryptophan. Tryptophan is what most people know is the precursor towards making serotonin, the so-called happy hormone, and melatonin. So people, if they have enough tryptophan, then they can divert that down a pathway to make their own niacin. But what that means is that their tryptophan is diverted away from making serotonin and melatonin. And that's one of the thoughts as to why people who have long COVID become severely depressed. They develop insomnia. They can no longer make their own sleep hormones. They can't make their hormones which balance their brain chemistry. So overall, we have a situation where these people who have long COVID are likely very severely depleted of at least one of the B vitamins. But what it seems like to me is that probably multiple of them, including thiamine, they're severely depleted. And when you get to that point, it's remarkably difficult to regain what you'd lost just from taking food. Okay, that's the key point that your listeners need to understand, is that when someone goes so far, it's remarkably hard, because if you lose, I'll give you an example. If you lose your digestive capacity, which many people do when they get long COVID, they develop IBS, they develop kind of malabsorption, digestive issues. Well, when you start losing the ability to digest your food, you develop this thing called malnutrition-induced malnutrition. Which basically means when you become low in one of the B vitamins that you need to have healthy gut function, niacin or thiamine, then you lose the ability to absorb all of the others, so you become malnourished across the board. And this is what happens for people who are chronically sick, is they become chronically low in many things, vitamins, minerals, cofactors, because they lose the ability to absorb things through the gut because of like an initial insult. So yeah, for people with long COVID, if the listeners are listening, they've heard me ramble on about thiamine and niacin. The practical points that I'm trying to get across is that if someone does have long COVID and they are interested in trying like a higher dose of a vitamin therapy, what we need to understand is that the majority of B vitamins are very safe, like very safe. We have some concerns with maybe B6. Maybe some of the others, particularly the minerals. But overall, if we're looking at the B1, B3, B9, B12, B5, they're remarkably safe to dose in quite high doses. Okay. So whilst that isn't medical advice, I want people to know that they're water soluble. The body does excrete what it can't use. Right. And so generally for a protocol for long COVID, I like to look at using thiamine in a form that someone can tolerate. I like to do that, start at a very low dose, looking at maybe 10, 15, 20 milligrams, working that up very gradually. And at the same time, and this is probably something that would differ between long COVID and other forms of post-viral fatigue, I like to use niacin in the form of nicotinamide riboside. There's a couple of companies who make it now. And I like to start at 300 milligrams and work up to maybe 1.2 grams, maybe 2 grams. Okay. Now, at the same time, I like to make sure that someone's got enough of the other Bs, including folate, particularly methylfolate and B12. And ideally, you can find that in a good B complex. I like to make sure that they have specific minerals. We've spoken about magnesium. One thing to know is that when someone does take thiamine, they take it in a high dose. What it can do is I suspect, increases the requirement for potassium. There's various reasons for that, but someone could develop kind of maybe a rapid heart rate. They find that they are having kind of dizziness or head pain, or kind of lightheadedness. Sometimes that can respond marvelously to a nice bit of like an electrolyte supplement, which contains a good dose of potassium, maybe 500 milligrams, 1000 milligrams per day. So magnesium and potassium I usually find are useful. At the same time, some minerals can also come in handy for long COVID, particularly zinc. Many people know that already. But other things which I found to support kind of how they are tolerating the nutritional supplementation is selenium, no more than kind of 200 micrograms per day, and molybdenum. Now, molybdenum can help people process the sulfur which is contained within thiamine, which causes a problem for certain people. So molybdenum, anywhere from kind of 150 to 800 micrograms per day. And selenium, as I said, 150 micrograms maximum, 200 micrograms.
You know, I definitely have to thank you for the molybdenum, yeah, for that one, because once I started taking actually high doses of beef organ supplements, I usually don't smell when I sweat, but oh my gosh, stink, stink, stink. And so both my partner and I thank you for that, because that has gotten a lot better from the molybdenum. And then the same thing happened with the high dose thiamine as well. So yes, thank you for that. That was very interesting. And how much zinc do you tend to recommend?
It really depends on each person. I mean, depending on the kind of diet, I get a lot of people who come to me, say they're on a purely carnivorous diet. Usually zinc is not something I'm going to recommend, right? It would be more likely to be copper. But if I'm dealing with someone who's on a plant-based diet or who has had chronic digestive issues, say H. pylori or some of the kind of stomach acid problem, I am going to be recommending probably 30 to 40 milligrams of zinc per day in any form, probably zinc citrate. However, with the minerals, not the electrolytes, so magnesium, potassium, sodium, but with the minerals, I'm a lot more strict in terms of dosing. Like I see a lot of people who take maybe 100 milligrams of zinc or something really high like that, and they're put on it by a practitioner, and they come to me and they've been on it for like 2 years and they don't take copper with it. And so what they've done is they've caused like a massive imbalance with zinc and copper. And many of their symptoms are due to like a copper deficiency. So I'm not too happy about high doses of zinc for prolonged periods of time. I would say, maximum 50 milligrams without testing. If testing justifies it, then by all means, sometimes I might even go higher. But if we don't have tests, I don't really like to go all that much higher than 25 milligrams if it's based on guesswork, depending on the context.
Yep. That totally makes sense. I just want to take a look and see. So you start fairly low with the thiamine and work up to it. Do you find that helps with some of the imbalances that can happen sometimes? So for instance, if someone, because that's the thing that blew my mind about Costantini's work, studies that were published, was that so he would start at 600, I think, of thiamine HCl, and then increase by 300 every 3 days. And that's jumping up massively and very quickly. So do you find that helps with maybe people who have tended to be sensitive with the thiamine otherwise?
Yeah, indeed. I myself, and well, I say but actually my clients over the years have had to learn the hard way. Unfortunately, yes, it does seem as though unless someone has a very robust constitution, right? If someone comes to me and says, look, I don't react to any supplements. I've got obstructive sleep apnea. I've got dysautonomia. I take a supplement and I don't even know that I've taken it. Those kinds of people, I will say, right, okay, yeah, let's start you on 1,000 milligrams. We'll start you on 500 milligrams or something like that. Because usually those people, they're the non-sensitive types. Yeah. Unfortunately, if we're looking at this kind of population, someone who's got long COVID or someone who's got CFS or ME, then it's usually the opposite way around, is that
Right.
these people are highly sensitive. And in those who are highly sensitive, more is not better and faster is not better. It's that you have to give your body, you have to understand that what you're doing is that when you're giving a nutrient, isolated nutrient, it's going to be having an effect, right? Even if you can't necessarily feel it, many times people can feel it. It's going to be doing something, right? But we need to give the body, in many cases, I think, particularly for sensitive individuals, give the body time to adapt. You see, what is probably happening, or what I think might be happening, and this is really Lonsdale's theory, right? This is Lonsdale's theory. What might happen is that over long periods of time, if someone has a chronic deficit in a nutrient, let's say thiamine, someone has a chronic insufficiency or lack of a need kind of thing, they will downregulate. It's possible, at least. Costantini, I think he thought a similar thing. Some people, for whatever reason, it could be genetic as well, but they will downregulate the machinery that uses that nutrient as a cofactor. Yeah, they'll downregulate it. What that means is they'll make less. You think if you've got a low amount of something coming in, you look at the standard Western diet, for instance. If someone's demand outweighs their intake, and you've got like a chronically low amount coming in over long periods of time, it doesn't make sense for you to invest so much energy into making the machinery which uses that nutrient if it's not going to be used. You see what I mean?
Right.
So I'll
Wow.
give you an
Yeah.
example, right? If you've got 10 lots of transketolase enzyme, and this is massively hypothetical. Do not quote me on this. I don't think it works like this, but just to understand it theoretically,
Right.
I think it might be what's happening. If you've got 10 lots of transketolase, that's an enzyme that uses thiamine, yet you've only got 6 lots of thiamine coming in, and it costs you money to maintain the 10 lots of transketolase machines kind of thing, it doesn't make economic sense to hold on to them. You know, if it costs you money, or here's another example, right? You've got 10 warehouses. Yeah. You're a businessman, you've got 10 warehouses, but you've only got enough workers to fill 6 warehouses. Okay. Yet it costs you money to maintain, to have all of the electricity, the heating, to maintain the 10 warehouses. It's very expensive. If that goes on for long enough, like, does it make you any sense? Does it make any sense for you to maintain the functioning of those 10 warehouses if you're only using 6 of them? It doesn't make sense, right?
Right.
So
Right.
what you're going to naturally do from an economics perspective is you're going to get rid of 4 of them. You're going to say, right, okay, we're not using this. We're only using 6. So what happens if that's 6, that's kind of using that analogy, if you've only got enough machinery to deal with a certain amount of B1, because you've been so used to having such a low amount for such a long time, then when all of a sudden you give your body a really high dose, it's very much a shock. And in some cases, it doesn't. I don't think the human body even knows how to deal with it. You know, it's like, wow, you know, we've finally got loads of this good stuff, but we don't have the machinery to actually to process it, to make use of it. So what we need to do is kind of edge someone in, get them used to the fact that they've got more of this special nutrient coming in, so that their body can start adapting, building the necessary machinery, so that then they can upregulate or speed up a lot of the processes that have been slowed down historically. I think that that's the way that Lonsdale described it. I've probably butchered his example, but overall, that's the way that I kind of conceptualize it, and that's how it seems to play out in real life. Is that you need to give your body some time and a time to adjust, time to get used to this newfound kind of nutrient status, and gradually build up. And the way that you do that, historically, the way that Lonsdale described it, and I found it does very much work like this, and this symptoms can be mitigated somewhat if you do the right thing. But basically, it's that, say someone is at baseline, okay? Someone's at baseline. They've not taken any supplement or anything like that. They've got CFS, long COVID, dysautonomia, chronic pain, you name it, they've got it, okay? They're here. So they might take thiamine, and they might notice that they go downhill. So their fatigue might go from a 70% to a 90%, okay? They go downhill. And say you give them 10 milligrams of thiamine. So you start them off at 10 milligrams, they go downhill with their symptoms, and then they stay there, right? What you need to do, or the way that you assess when to increase the dose, is you wait until the symptoms return back to baseline.
Yeah.
Okay. So if they go downhill, you don't increase the dose further. You wait. Okay. You wait, and it might take a week, might take 2 weeks, might take 3 weeks, might take a month. But if it's such a low dose, it's going to be doing minimal damage. Okay. So you wait. When they return back to baseline, they might say, oh, okay, well, when I started, my fatigue was at 60%. When I took the thiamine, my fatigue went up to 80%. But after 2 weeks, my fatigue returned back. Actually, it improved to 55%. So they return back to baseline, but a slightly higher level than before. You do the same thing. Then you increase the dose. And the rate at which you increase it is going to depend on when they return back to baseline. So you might increase the dose. You might say, okay, let's double it or let's triple it. So you go up to maybe 50 milligrams. And they go downhill again, but usually it's not for as long this time. It's usually for a week rather than 2 weeks. And then they return back to baseline. And then again, you keep doing that. If you go gung-ho and you give someone who's really sensitive 500 milligrams to start off with, you notice that they probably get insomnia for 2 days, heart palpitations, and end up going to the ER because they think they're going insane.
Right. Totally.
And it is that powerful, right? And usually it's the people who have that kind of response who are likely to be the people who really benefit from the nutrient.
Wow.
So that's why it's paradoxical, because the people who have the very severe symptoms are usually the ones that are so low in it that actually could benefit. It's just, it takes patience. And sometimes the paradoxical symptoms is that they might be depleting another B vitamin, or they might be depleting a mineral. I had someone the other day who took thiamine, had been going up on quite higher doses, forgot to take magnesium one day, and then noticed that they got terrible palpitations, headache, and insomnia. Okay. Again, because what you're doing is you're raising the requirement for lots of other things, you need to be quite diligent about making sure to take all of the cofactors with it. And again, it can be quite nuanced, right? And it's different for each person. And if someone does have access to testing, by all means, then that is really like a quick way, or that's a better way to identify this. If someone's doing it themselves, best to start very low, very slow, experiment with some of the other B vitamins based on symptoms. Some people respond very well to B6, for instance. Some people don't. So again, I'm actually in the process of building a course, like a 15-hour course at the moment, both for laymen and practitioners. To go through all the details on this, because there's too much to explain in 1 hour, right? But there are processes by which you can narrow down why someone's not responding, differential diagnosis and things. So
sign me up. Seriously, I'll be there. That is just incredible. Now, in your experience with using these approaches with people with ME/CFS, with post-viral fatigue, with even with long COVID, I know it's still kind of soon, but do they have to continue taking these high levels in order to continue having those positive effects, or are people able to start to ramp things down? How does that work?
Okay, so the minority of people require it indefinitely. Okay. Not sure why that is. I mean, looking at some people's genetics and things, there do seem to be genetic predispositions to not being able to get thiamine into cells. There seems to be problems with activating B1. There seems to be underlying, I suspect, toxicities, environmental factors, mold, inflammation, which are depleting B1. I mean, something I haven't spoken about is that COVID in and of itself, right? One of the reasons why I think that COVID is a major trigger for B1 is that any infection is raising the requirements for metabolism. It's raising what I mean by metabolism is the rate at which you're generating energy, building up things, breaking things down to deal with the infection, right? So it's like you could be coasting along at this level, no major stressors, and you're fine. But then you get an infection and the requirement for everything, energy across the board, goes up. Like, that's how your immune system works. And so if people do not have enough to meet that demand, they go into like a hypercatabolic state, right? And this is characterized in the literature. If someone has a very severe infection, that is enough to trigger or unmask, to use what little thiamine they did have. If they didn't have a lot, or say they were coasting at kind of like a ordinary status, If they go a good couple of days where they've got a really high demand and they can't meet that demand, it's like, boom, that's a trigger. Okay, that's a trigger. And so in that kind of situation, I mean, that can be applied chronically as well. You know, you've got someone with chronic inflammation. Well, chronic inflammation depletes many of the nutrients. It depletes B6 on site. It depletes thiamine. Because what it's doing, it's like it's triggering your immune system is activated. You are running through things at a faster rate than you ordinarily would do. And so if someone has lots of other things going on, say they've got an infection, they might be one of the people who requires kind of high doses, or if they've got a neurodegenerative condition, like an autoimmune Parkinson's, MS, like these people generally need to be on it for life. Okay. I'm not sure why that is. And what suggests to me is that it's not addressing the cause.
Right.
Like there's something else which is like blocking the enzymes which are needed to make energy and like have a healthy nervous system. So what it's doing is it's kind of it's a band-aid for that situation. But when we don't know what's causing the problem, it's better than nothing. You know?
Yeah.
On the other hand, I'd say for the majority of people, they don't need it. They don't. And what they often find is that actually they get to a point where they have too much. You know. So I give an example. Individual came to me, had been, I mean, this guy had spent thousands, like tens of thousands on GI doctors, on fatigue specialists, on all this other kind of stuff.
Yep.
Right. Had done all the testing, fecal microbial, microbial transplants, the lot.
Oh, like yeah. Okay.
He'd done it. And he was still basically housebound, sofa bound, couldn't exercise, you know, napping kind of 4 or 5 times every single day. We got him on very high doses of TTFD. Within a week or so, he had regained kind of 80 to 90% of his energy, right? Now, his original trigger was, it was actually a virus. So it was a post-viral fatigue kind of thing. Now, he had done this for, it became a little bit of a crutch for him. So he had done this for 4 months, maybe 4 or 5 months. All of a sudden, he started noticing changes in his digestive system, started developing like chronic diarrhea. It was only when we reduced the thiamine, which he was cautious about doing, you know, he didn't want to reduce it. But when we reduced the B1, he found that actually the diarrhea went away, and that his sign and symptom of excess B1 was digestive distress, right? Or sometimes it can be people feel really wired, they feel really switched on, they feel like they can't go to sleep, or they feel like stressed out. And that can be a sign that they've actually got too much that they can't process. It becomes like a stimulant, right? And that's not great. They feel like they've drunk too many cups of coffee. So it's usually a couple of months. That's, I would say, probably 70 to 80% of people. If they do need high doses, it's usually for a couple of months, then they can come down on it. Other people, not so much. It depends if the root cause was the B vitamin deficiency in the first place, or like the metabolic dysfunction, which could be like fixed in terms of fixing the cause by the B vitamins. If it's not that, if it's an infection, if it's mold, if it's something that we don't know about, but it's there, that's tanking B1 status, then they're likely going to need B1 until they find the cause. And in some people, when you don't know what the cause is, but they benefit from B1, they take B1. You know, it's certainly a lot cheaper than taking most kind of prescription drugs, you know, from big pharma. So most people are more than happy because it actually works. So
and without too many bad side effects once you do get the, you know, the right combination within there. And you know, that theory actually makes a lot of sense to me too, because there are people who get COVID and seem to recover, and then a month or even more out, something happens and they end up developing long COVID. So we're talking about the, you know, the straw that broke the camel's back, or that, that COVID infection took their B1 levels down so much that then when they experience this other stressor, then that was the straw right there. So
yeah, and that's a similar concept that is thought to be the case in like the research looking at niacin NAD pools. It's similar concept. It's the COVID, the infection, the fact that you're depleting your niacin, or this niacin breakdown product or activation product, NAD, you're depleting NAD during this period of infection. Like, it's very difficult to replenish that. Like, it could take a long time to replenish that. And you see, there's like diseases of a maladaptation as well, right? It's like your body will adapt with what little it has. When it doesn't have much of something, like, it will adapt to that. It will try to adapt. But again, you're coasting on the edge, and any small trigger can then like cause a tank, a crash. I mean, you could call it long COVID, or you could say it's a mixture, conglomeration of a variety of different stressors, which have increased your demand so much that you cannot match that demand. And whether that's for, whatever that might be. So again, you can no longer, you can't adapt, you end up kind of, your system just collapses. And this is what was originally called adrenal fatigue. This is what they thought of as adrenal fatigue, but now it's rarely anything to do with the adrenals. It's like a variety of kind of adaptations or maladaptations to a situation where you're basically doing the best with the little that you've got. So again, if you can't find the root cause, then I think that the best thing to do is to focus on building energy. Every single cell of the human body needs energy. And a lot of the things that go wrong with any kind of fatigue syndrome, including long COVID, are relating to energy. So the chances are, if you can address or try to support how the cells are making energy through whatever means, then you're likely not going to, it's very little likelihood that you'll ever do harm through doing that, but you're likely to see some benefit. Whether it cures the problem or not, you'll be in a better position than where you originally were.
Right. Wow. So you have given us all so much information here, more specifics and more about the interactions of these different nutrients and the requirements and yeah, just a way to address it. So for anyone who is watching this and wants to know more about your work, what's the best way for them to do that?
Well, I have a website. It's eonutrition.co.uk. And I make some videos on YouTube. The idea is that I'm going to kind of, over the next couple of months, I'm going to be making a lot more. And I do a little bit of writing here and there. I guess the main aim at the moment, like my primary interest, is thiamine, as you probably already know. That's my primary interest at the moment. I'd like to investigate that further. I'd like to continue delving into that. I like looking at the mechanisms and the interactions and things, but also to try to spread the word as much as possible, so to try to speak with other doctors and practitioners. And there's a lot who are interested. I have many people get in contact with me quite frequently who say, look, I'd never heard of this. I get a lot of people get in contact with me, just randomers. They're not my clients. They're not doctors. They're not practitioners. They're just random people who have come across my videos or my writing. They have found it interesting. They've applied it to themselves, and they have seen like miraculous benefits. So I always like to hear from people. My email address is on my website. If someone does want to get in contact and share a story or anything, more than happy to kind of hear that as well. I like feedback. But yeah, I mean, I'm also on Facebook. I don't really post on there very often. And I do have an Instagram account, but I don't really know how to use Instagram. So there's I think there's 3 posts on there at the moment, and there's probably not going to be many in the future. But by all means, if there's any chance, then you can always follow me on there. But yeah, as I said, I'm probably going to be building. Well, I've started laying the foundations for this. I've got 2 things in the pipeline. I'm going to be coming out with a very beginner's guide to identifying and kind of addressing thiamine deficiency. I think it's something that goes massively overlooked. Very few doctors know anything about it in terms of like a chronic health setting. They use it. They think they're taught that alcoholics and people with gastric surgery, they're the main people who are affected by this. But ultimately, like, none of the alternative or functional doctors or even nutritionists really use this nutrient. So what I'd like to do is provide a resource for learners, so laymen who don't have the science background, to look at this, to learn about this, and to just get the real basics in terms of, okay, I try this, then I do this, then I do this. This is what I look out for. Really basic recommendations. At the same time, for people who I like to call kind of citizen scientists, or people who are a little bit geeky, they like the details, and practitioners and doctors and things who want to also learn about this, how to apply it clinically, what to look out for in terms of testing, how to monitor someone's progress through various types of tests, through genetics, through all of this stuff that's kind of not really all that well available to the general public. And that's going to be a lot more detail oriented with all the biochemistry and everything. I will be focusing on that as well. The idea is to kind of, that's my main project that I'm working on at the moment, with the main idea to kind of get everything in one place, everything that I know in one place, and hopefully more people will pay attention, and hopefully people might be they might be able to benefit from using B1. Because I tell you, Chandler Mars on Hormones Matter and Derek Lonsdale, I mean, he has been tiring away. He's been working on this for decades.
He's
and
in his 90s.
I know.
Yeah.
I know. I think he's 96, right? So he's been trying to tell medicine about this for such a long time, and no one has listened to him, or a handful of people have listened to him, And so ultimately, Chandler Mars, she's been doing an excellent job. Really, if you look online, there's not many websites, if any, that talk about B1 in terms of its wide variety of clinical application. All of the case studies, things, there's a handful of us who talk about this, and it should get so much more attention, because I'm telling you, I'm 100% convinced that the amount of people that can benefit from using this nutrient, its clinical utility is absolutely untapped. And that's the reason why I focus so much on it, right? Because I've seen it work miracles, and I'm 100% confident that that there's many people who also are in great need of this and are not getting it because either nutritionists, doctors, or they are not taught about it. They don't know what to look out for. So so that's the kind of aim at the moment, trying to spread awareness, which I think you are also trying to do, right? You've had three people in on the show on this summit.
Yeah.
So
we have four of our 25 speakers are on thiamine, high dose thiamine therapy. So yeah, I'm there with you. And, thank you so much for having this mission and for helping out so many people. And everybody, keep an eye out for Elliot's upcoming basics book. And if you like to geek out like I do, then for his program as well. And I'm going to put a link to his site down below, and I can't wait to see what happens next.
Excellent. Well, yeah, thanks for having me on.